Reading from the Srimad Bhagavatam, 2nd Canto, 5th Chapter, 21st Text. Kalam karma svabhavam cha mayesho mayaya swayam atman yadrichaya praptam vibabushir vadade. Kalam karma svabhavam cha Maisho mayaya swaya Atman yadrichaya priptam Vibhubushurabdadate Kalam karma svabhavam cha Maisho mayaya swaya Atman yadrichaya praptam Vibhushir Bhadate.
Kalam karma svabhavam cha
Kalam karma svabhavam cha
Maisho mayaya swaya Atman yadrichaya praptam
Atman yadrichaya praptam Vibhushir Bhadate.
Kalam karma svabhavam cha
Kalam
Mayesha Maya Saya Kalam Karma Subhavam Cha Mayesho Maya Svaya Atman Yadrichaya Praptam Kalam, eternal time. Karma, the fate of the living entity. Bhavavam, nature. Cha, also. Maya, potency. Isha, the controller. Mayaya, by the energy. Svaya, of his own. Atman, Atmani, unto his self. Yadrichaya, independently. Praptam, being merged in. Babubushu, appearing differently. Upadade, accepted for being created again. Translation by Srila Prabhupada. The Lord, who is the controller of all energies, thus creates by his own potency. Eternal time, the fate of all living entities and their particular nature for which they were created. And he again merges them independently. Responsibly, the Lord, who is the controller of all energies, thus creates by his own potency, eternal time, the fate of all living entities and their particular nature for which they were created. And he again merges them independently. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. The creation of the material world, wherein the conditioned souls are allowed to act subordinately by the Supreme Lord, takes place again and again after being repeatedly annihilated. The material creation is something like a cloud in the unlimited sky. The real sky is the spiritual sky, eternally filled with the rays of the Brahma Jyoti. And a portion of this unlimited sky is covered by the Mahatattva cloud of the material creation, in which the conditioned souls who want to lord it against the will of the Lord are put into play as they desire under the control of the Lord disappears regularly. The creation takes place and is again annihilated under the control of the Lord, as confirmed in Bhagavad Gita 8:19. So the creation and annihilation of the material world is a regular action of the Lord, just to allow the conditioned souls to play as they like, and thereby create their own fate by being differently created again in terms of their independent desires at the time of annihilation. The creation, therefore, takes place at a historical date, open paren, as we are accustomed to think of everything which has a beginning in our tiny experience, end paren. The process of creation and annihilation is called anadi, or without reference to date regarding the time the creation first took place, because the duration of even a partial creation is 8,640,000,000 years. The law of creation is, however, as mentioned in the Vedic literatures, that it is created at certain intervals and is again annihilated by the will of the Lord. The whole material, or even the spiritual creation, is a manifestation of the energy of the Lord, just as the light and heat of a fire are different manifestations of the fire's energy. The Lord therefore exists in his impersonal form by such expansions of energy and the complete creation rests on his impersonal feature. Nonetheless, he keeps himself distinct from such creation as the Purnam, open paren, or complete end paren. And so no one should wrongly think that his personal feature is not existent due to his impersonal unlimited expansions. The impersonal expansion is a manifestation of his energy, and he is always in his personal feature, despite his innumerable unlimited expansions of impersonal energies. Bhagavad Gita 9.5 to 9.57 in Paran. For human intelligence, it is very difficult to conceive how the whole creation rests on his expansion of energy. But the Lord has given a very good example in the Bhagavad Gita. It is said that although the air and the atoms rest within the huge expansion of the sky, which is like the resting reservoir of everything materially created, still the sky remains separate and unaffected. Similarly, although the Supreme Lord maintains everything created by his expansions of energy, he always remains separate. This is accepted even by Shankaracharya, the great advocate of the impersonal form of the Absolute. He says, Narayana Parak Vyakta, or Narayan, exists separately, apart from the impersonal creative energy. The whole creation thus merges within the body of transcendental Narayan at the time of annihilation. And the creation emanates from his body again with the same unchanging categories of fate and individual nature. The individual living entities, being parts and parcels of the Lord, are sometimes described as Atma, qualitatively one in spiritual constitution. But because such living entities are apt to be attracted to the material creation actively and subjectively, they are therefore different from the Lord. The verse again, translation by Srila Prabhupada. The Lord, who is the controller of all energies, thus creates by his own potency, eternal time, the fate of all living entities and their particular nature for which they were created. And he again merges them independently. Hukam karoti vachalam pangam langayate girim yat kripa tarham bande Shri Guru Dinatarane. This very philosophical purport refers to the combination of oneness and difference, or achintya Veda Veda Tattva. The word achintya is used, meaning inconceivable, because to conceive of something that is both one and different is impossible. Sometimes the living entities are described as nityabada, or eternally conditioned, and sometimes the devotees are described as nitya siddha, eternally liberated. So the question arises, how can one be eternally liberated, and how can another be eternally conditioned? So Prabhupada gives a sort of hint as to how that can be understood by saying that the creation therefore takes place at a historical date, as we are accustomed to think of everything which has a beginning in our tiny experience, and so what he's saying here, as far as I understand, is that we think everything has a beginning and an end, or we see that actually is the case, that every living entity comes into being, grows, sustains, has offspring, dwindles, and dies. So there's always a beginning and an end. This is the condition of nityabhata, or eternally conditioned. But there are living entities who are nitya siddha, or living, or eternally liberated. So the question is, how can an eternally liberated soul be at one time a eternally conditioned soul? that it appears to be paradoxical or inconceivable. It is inconceivable. In the word achintya, or inconceivable, is used in reference to Veda, abeda, beta, abeda, tattva, that how something can be eternally liberated and eternally conditioned, or how can a person gravitate from or move from an eternally conditioned situation into an eternally liberated situation. So the statement in the purport here is that the creation takes place at a historical date, but it's mentioned in several of the writings of Srila Prabhupada that it is impossible to trace out the exact date when, or to find out exactly the correct, proper time, conceivable time, at which we, the living entities, became conditioned. So it's a very mysterious and inconceivable thing to think that there's always a movement of, and as is mentioned here, the material world is like a cloud in the sky. It's known as also as the Ekapad Vibhuti, and the spiritual world is called the Tripad Vibhuti, which is meaning that it's 3 times or 75% of the entire creation, and the material world is only 25% of the creation. So it does seem that there's a movement of living entities from the Tripad Vibhuti, from the eternally liberated condition, to the eternally conditioned living entities. But it's inconceivable because it doesn't make any common sense to this sense that we think things are. There's a beginning and an end to everything. But according to Vedic philosophy, there's such a thing as eternity, which means there's no beginning and no end. Something exists eternally, and that's what the soul is. The soul is something that exists like Krishna eternally. So that's the qualitative oneness that where we're all like Krishna. So it's a very very complicated and sophisticated philosophy, and it can't be sort of quantified and measured as we're used to doing in ordinary things. The material world is always existing, even though it's a kind of an aberration, or the cloud in the sky. One lecture, Prabhupada ended with the words, he was talking about the fact that there will always be opposition to the Krishna consciousness movement. There will always be atheistic people, always people that are godless, and will be aggravated always at the very mention of God. And there are theists, people who are actually convinced that everything, material or spiritual, is the manifestation of God's energy. And another interesting point is that people, as Prabhupada writes in the purport, are very fond of material energy. Maya is very strong, and it's so strong that it even takes people away who are very much addicted to Krishna consciousness. They like the music, they like the cleanliness, they like the camaraderie, they like the food. But those very same people tend to go away at some point. Why? Because the attraction of the material energy is very, very powerful and very strong. And whether it's music or nature or the element of goodness, people are very enamored with this energy. So this energy is always going on. And what I was getting to is Prabhupada ended a lecture in 1972 in Vrindavan by saying, and Johnny Walker is still going strong. There was uproarious laughter after that, because most of the people he was lecturing to were Americans, and they knew that Johnny Walker is the name of a whiskey, a very popular brand of whiskey. Johnny Walker is still going strong, and the laughter was so uproarious and so loud, louder than anything else I had heard, that I had to listen to it 2 or 3 times to understand what he was actually saying. But the people who were present actually heard the words, Johnny Walker is still going strong. And maybe Prabhupada got it from advertising he saw in the New York underground subways. But that opposition is still going strong. I experienced kind of opposition, or you might call it corruption, and this is a little bit of a walk down memory lane. In 1971, when our fame as rock stars was beginning to wane, and after a year or so, I mean, even though the agents were trying to get in many engagements for us all over the country, England, and all over Europe, there was always a great need for more money to do things, to make the Krishna consciousness movement very strong and very powerful. So another devotee and I decided to get some incense, because incense was the backbone of income for temples in the United States for a long time. So we thought we'll do the same thing in England. So we made up we got spiritual sky incense sticks from Los Angeles to London, and put them in little packages, and we kind of copied the slogan, each stick burns for 1 hour, which was kind of a unique thing for an incense package. It was written in French. I think the phrase was, for those of you who know French would know this, chaque bâton qui brûle une heure, which means that each stick burns for 1 hour. So another devotee and I rented a vehicle, drove to Dover from London, which is about a 3-hour drive, and then this was before the tunnels under the English Channel were built. We deposited the car back at the Hertz Rent-A-Car people, and took a boat to Calais, which was the first landing place in France. And we had a whole suitcase full of these incense packages that said chaque bâton qui brûle une heure. And all the customs people passed everything, even though, probably was not exactly the usual thing. But anyway, we passed it, and we rented another car from the same company, Hertz Rent-A-Car. And before we got to Paris, there were these checkpoints along the way. They were like little booths that you had to go through. And when we got to one of them, the customs agents, dressed as policemen, or they call them gendarmes, and they looked very official. They said, we didn't speak any French. And one of them, we found out later, knew a little bit of Spanish, and I knew a little bit of Spanish, so we could communicate. But anyway, they made us sit in the back seat of the car. After they opened all the suitcases and they saw this incense. And then they asked us to get in the back seat. Kind of through hand motion, we understood that was happening. And it was pouring down rain, I remember, and it was about 7 o'clock in the morning, and they drove over very back roads, and we were beginning to wonder, what kind of policemen are these? And then they went to a house that was in a very remote, rural area of France, and we were about halfway between Calais and Paris at the time. And they knocked on the door, and finally, after knocking very loudly, a man came to the door, white-haired man, and apparently he was some kind of a judge, and he signed the paper that these guys gave him, and they got back in the car and drove on. And we were still sitting in the back, not knowing anything. And then they drove us to a construction site, which was a building that wasn't complete. And in front of it, a person had a jackhammer. A jackhammer is making a real loud noise, kind of deafening. And they started questioning us. They took us inside the building and on the ground floor started questioning us. And then we began to slowly realize that these weren't real policemen. It was some kind of corrupt deviation or something from the police force. And because I have a very suspicious mind, I thought that maybe they were going to torture us, and that these guys that were making the big noise outside would cover our screams and protests. But finally, we ascertained, and this guy spoke a little bit of Spanish, and I spoke a little bit of Spanish, ascertained that we were importing what he called contraband. I don't know what the French word is for contraband, but he was trying to say that the incense was cannabis or marijuana or something like that, and we couldn't do it. So we didn't know what to. And finally, we said, well, okay, if we're breaking the law, then take us to prison. And he just changed the subject and started talking, and then we were sort of escorted back into the car and drove to another place which was also in a remote little village area of France somewhere, where we didn't know what it was. And it was a kind of a tenement building. And the ground floor, we were deposited into a room. They took all of our incense, the suitcase full of incense, into another room. And we found out later that they made a phone call to the Hertz Rent-A-Car people in Calais, and they convinced them that they were bona fide policemen. They were. I think this tenement building housed all the policemen, not all the policemen, but it was a housing project for police. So they convinced the Hertz Rent-A-Car people to drive all the way from Calais to their place, and they give them all our deposit money. And meanwhile, we were being guarded in this little room with no windows. And finally, the guard admitted to us that it was kind of a combination of French and Spanish and sign language, that actually what they wanted was a bribe. They wanted our incense, they wanted our money. And if we'd only known, if we'd only been a little more worldly, we would have given them something like $10 or $20 right at the beginning, and we would have been on our merry way to Paris, and that would have been the end of it. But no, they made it very complicated. They got all the deposit money, and they divided it probably all among themselves, and it probably didn't amount to more than a few dollars. And they took all our incense and all the money we had. We were at that time. We still didn't know for sure what was going on, but then they finally chucked us out into the middle of France without hardly anything, just a few packages of incense. Somehow we managed to sell the few packs of incense that we had on the metro, the train, or the underground, and we finally got to Paris. And I was so outraged at the whole thing that I thought, when I get back to London, I'll phone the Hertz Rent-A-Car people and we'll file a lawsuit against these people. So when I got, finally, somehow or other, we got back to England. And when I got back to England, I phoned the Hertz Rent-A-Car people, and they said, there's actually nothing that we can do because they're known as the Flying Customs. And then he proceeded to tell us that they were a corrupt branch of the of customs, and that they did this routinely for bribe money. So we lost all our incense, we lost all our money, we lost everything trying to get some money for the temple, all in the service of Prabhupada, and always showing that there's corruption everywhere. When I was in New Zealand, students said that the corruption goes on even in the United States, but you don't notice it because it's sort of hidden. Like the lobbyists in Washington bribe the legislators to pass or not pass a bill by giving them millions of dollars, whereas in a place like where there's less place like Ukraine or Thailand, you just give the police $10 or $20 and they're very friendly and they just let you go, and that's the end of it. So this is my first anyway encounter of being a naive and innocent sort of 25-year-old of corruption in sort of in uniform in high places. So that really happened anyway. That's the story. All for the sake of getting money for the temple. So these things are always going on. Johnny Walker is still going strong, and the few people that are sitting in this room or watching on their screens in some faraway places know that we're a very small percentage of the whole population, which is something like 9 billion people, and maybe we have a few million people at the most, which is a very tiny percentage. So to think that we're going to change the face of the world is a little bit naive and lulling ourselves into a kind of false sense of security. And I mean, Prabhupada did say that the face of the world could change if people became Krishna conscious, but that's a pretty big order. But it may be. I mean, some people say that it has begun already. So that's probably everything I have to say. And if there's any comments or questions about anything, please go on. I'll read the verse again. The Lord, who is the controller of all energies, thus creates by his own potency, eternal time, the fate of all living entities and their particular nature for which they were created. And he again merges them independently. So one thing that this verse brings to mind is the fact that there are atheistic people, and even the atheistic people get their intelligence, so-called intelligence, from God, and they're indirectly Krishna conscious. They're just somewhat forgetful, and therefore they build big buildings, they build spaceships, and they try to go to other planets, and so on and so forth. All this is actually part of God's energy. Maybe it's not the energy that's adorable, but it is God's energy, because He's everywhere. Even the rocks and the earth and the trees are part of His energy. And of course, a lot of people believe that too, that God is love, God is nature, God is flowers, and so on and so forth. So that's the Ekapad, and sometimes this Ekapad Vibhuti, or this material world, is known as the three worlds: the lower, middle, and upper planetary systems. But as Prabhupada has said repeatedly in purports, that this is still material. It's not the spiritual world. There's another world where there is no such thing as beginning and end. There's no such thing as unhappiness. There's no such thing as lust. There is such a world. It's a world where people who live in that world can be eternally happy. And if they're not in that world, they see beginning and end. They're happy sometimes sad. And it's the world of duality, or as it's sometimes said, it's mrityu, the world of death. This is the material world that we live in, which we're trying to make the best use of a bad bargain, so to speak. So, any comments or questions?
Just a comment on the it's still occurring. I remember in 1997 we were doing something similar to raise money in the Black Forest in Germany, and we were tinkering away, putting the mousses. We were selling the mousses. I don't know if you know of these wooden things that devotees would sell, like massage mousses. We banged them all together in a building, and at night and sell them at day. Anyway, a lady who was renting the house, she found a picture of Prabhupada's feet, as devotees would have, and she called the police on us, and we'd been there quite some time, weeks, almost a month. And then they all came. There was like 6 police cars and dogs, Alsatian dogs. Anyway, they just blew the cult alarm in Germany, and they removed us all into Paris. Just the comment is that Paris is into France. We went through those same checkpoints, and they also pulled us aside. This was in 1995. You're talking 1971. So the same thing happened. They wanted something, but we didn't speak the language. If we knew, they gave us a very terrible time at those checkpoints. So that's the comment, that it still exists. And they wanted something from us, but we couldn't speak the language. But they got physical also with us, because we couldn't speak their language. So they're very corrupt, very rude, and So that's just the comment. That's still going on. Hare Krishna.
Thank you, Maharaj. Thank you for sharing your ordeal, what happened. But at that point, you could have given up your Krishna consciousness and thought, why didn't Krishna allow you to go and collect money for him selling the incense? So I'd like to hear about your faith and how it helped.
Well, it's like Parma Karuna was saying, that many devotees in those days, 1970, 69, 70, 71, 72, went through a great many difficulties to spread Krishna consciousness, and we encountered what the opposition was like by encountering sometimes government. I mean, there was a great struggle in Bombay. If you want to read the details, Giriraj's book is there. I'll build you a temple. And in Russia, devotees were imprisoned, and some of them died because that particular government thought that the devotees were doing weird things that were against the government. So, and it's not that they just, of course we did make some errors and some mistakes, but the point is that there are always going to be opponents. Just like there's always going to be warfare. I mean, no one likes it, but it always exists. And so it's very difficult. And devotees are convinced that what they're doing is right, and they face this opposition, and they continue on, knowing that it's an atheistic point of view. These people that are corrupt are just another form of atheism. In its ugly face, we might say. I mean, there was so much opposition in Russia that the devotees, when they first went out onto the streets, they had to wear Western clothes because they would have just been thrown in jail otherwise. Anyway, a lot of that level of persecution is pretty much in the past. Thank goodness.
Do you ever question Krishna why he, makes you suffer like that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, there's like different opinions about why we suffer, and sometimes it's actually said in the Bhagavatam that the more Krishna makes you suffer, it takes things away from you. Tadanam hridaye shanai. Something like that. That the more he's making you move towards surrender. Harishe taranam shanai. And Prabhupada has mentioned this several times. But that doesn't mean that we stop. We just carry on. Because we know that Krishna is all-powerful. And that if we're doing his bidding, if we're executing his orders, then we'll succeed, even though it may be very impossibly difficult at times. So, yes?
If someone's been living in fire, that's the material world.
Mm-hmm.
For predominantly a lot longer than say other people, but enjoy the Krishna conscious a lot, is it? And like the chanting, the serving, but find their mind very active to want to withdraw, is it okay to just sort of kind of like it?
Well, from a internal point of view, one can say that the godless people are unhappy, even though they may put on a happy face. But it sounds a bit dismal and pessimistic to say that we all have to die, and there's downs for every up there's a down, and for every good feeling there's a bad feeling. But this is a perception of the theist, and theists are dhira and adhira. They're dear to the ruffians, and they're dear to the spiritualists. So if a person's enjoying life, we don't try to discourage him. We just try to tell him the truth, and it becomes obvious what is being said about God and Krishna consciousness is true, even though people may not believe it. There's a saying that there are no atheists in the foxholes, and when people are in a plane that's about to crash, they start praying to God, even though they're very atheistic. So there are times when the atheist becomes theistic, and it's a very dire prediction that you have to die, and you're going to lose everything at some point. Harishe taranam shanai. It's a very, very sort of morbid thing to talk about, but it's reality. Unfortunately, that's the unfortunate truth. But at the same time, the devotees don't try to stop anyone who's enjoying life. Instead of taking things away, we just would say to you add Krishna consciousness. You know that Krishna is responsible for whatever happiness you can acquire. That's the good side of things. And a person who is theistic will see some truth in that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, I think we'll end here. Thank you. Oh, yeah. There's one more question. We'll have one last one.
Just back to your story, I was just wondering, so like those people that treat you so badly and people that fight in wars, and do you always practice full compassion for those kind of people?
Well, even like you could say it of a person who commits rape or murder, that he's just having, or she is just having a bad day, and or is, you know, very deeply forgetful. And sometimes the devotees use words like demons and, you know, very caustic phrases to talk about people. But even those people can be awakened to Krishna consciousness. And so instead of there's a Christian saying, I think it's Christian, that says, hate the sin, not the sinner. So some people are very inimical to each other, and they're very inimical to devotees. But even they can have their Krishna consciousness revived. According to the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, people are the way they are because they're forgetful of Krishna. So this Krishna consciousness is not inventing something, but it's revealing something that's already there. Nityasiddha Krishna Prema Sajja Kabunai. There is Krishna consciousness in everyone, and the process of chanting is an awakening process. It's possible. It's not always going to happen to everyone, but it is possible. It's something that happens occasionally. You see what does that make any sense?
I think sometimes I wonder for myself how to practice. If you see something that's wrong according to your beliefs, and
there's a saying in I think it was Hamlet that said something like, he was contemplating suicide in this drama, and he says, to be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing end them. So what this means is that it's a constant dilemma that we face. Whether if we see a drowning man, should we save him? From a karmic point of view, we don't save him. We just don't interfere with. He's dying because he's sinful or he deserved it. So that's a very brutal kind of attitude. But we have to see, if other people are watching, we would save the man, because we do have to consider what other people say and other people are thinking, even though they don't know anything about the law of karma, or maybe they don't know anything about that. They're just ignorant. So we have to consider that ignorant position and make adjustments accordingly. So I think we'll stop there, and it's getting to be very, very internal. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna. HH Mukunda Maharaj ki.